From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, the next time the follow button is just about to put the last piece in their 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, walk over and smash it to the ground. This episode is called Down to 75 Pounds. In August of 2010, 19-year-old Mackenzie Hild hunched over her clipboard inside a large canvas tent in Rwanda. She had just finished her freshman year at Harvard University and was spending the summer working with HIV patients as a volunteer for a medical aid group. Mackenzie finished scribbling some patient notes onto her clipboard, then set it on a folding table alongside clipboards from other volunteers. She felt a little sad that the summer was coming to an end. While she was looking forward to going back to college, she'd never felt more fulfilled than over these past 3 months. Since childhood, she dreamed of working as a doctor in Africa. In fact, this was actually her second trip to the continent. She spent last summer working in a clinic in Uganda. She rubbed her eyes and then stretched and yawned, and as she did, she suddenly jerked in pain. There was a sharp cramp in her stomach, like someone had stabbed it with a knife. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, hoping the pressure would relieve the pain, but the cramping only got worse. It was not the first time this had happened. In fact, she'd had stomach cramps almost every day since she arrived in Rwanda a few months ago. Her stomach always started hurting shortly after she ate. It had gotten so bad that she was now skipping breakfast and eating as little as possible for lunch and dinner. The same thing had happened last summer in Uganda, too. She'd lost 15 pounds over 3 months. Luckily, once she got home, her weight went back to normal. So, despite being surrounded by doctors this summer, Mackenzie hadn't told anyone about her stomach pains. She figured they were just a side effect of her anti-malarial drugs. She'd be home in a few days, and the ache would go away, and she'd regain the weight she'd lost over the summer. So she took some deep breaths, riding out the pain until it subsided. Once she was feeling a bit better, Mackenzie stood up straight again. Then she went back to work and pushed the stomachache out of her mind. A few days later, Mackenzie's mom, Joanne Hild, stood with her husband Wayne in the Sacramento airport, about 65 miles from their home in Nevada City, California. Joanne was giddy with excitement. She hadn't seen Mackenzie in 3 months and couldn't wait to pull her daughter in for a big bear hug. But when Mackenzie finally walked through the doors, Joanne was shocked. Her daughter had lost a lot of weight. Mackenzie had always been thin, but now she looked downright skeletal. Joanne looked to Wayne, who seemed equally worried. He mumbled that she must have lost a good 20 or 30 pounds. Joanne agreed, but she forced herself to smile as her daughter saw them and came rushing over. That night, Joanne sat in the living room with her daughter and husband, watching Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. Joanne had ordered pizza for dinner, thinking that a few hearty meals would help Mackenzie put the weight back on. But as they sat together, eating and watching TV, Joanne couldn't help but notice that Mackenzie hardly touched her food. And when she did take a bite, she winced, like it had a bad taste or something. She asked her daughter about it, and Mackenzie explained she hadn't been eating much recently because her stomach hurt so badly after meals. She smiled and promised her mom she would eat more once the anti-malarial meds wore off. But Joanne didn't think that sounded right. Losing a little weight might be a side effect of anti-malarial medication, but pain so intense that her daughter was skipping meals? That had to be something else. She told Mackenzie they were going to go to the doctor first thing in the morning. Mackenzie nodded, now looking a bit scared. Joanne hadn't meant to upset her daughter, but she wasn't willing to wait to see what happened either. The next morning, Joanne sat with Mackenzie in the waiting room at the local clinic. They'd met with the doctor briefly, and he had ordered a full battery of tests, including tests for tropical diseases, HIV, and digestive disorders like Crohn's. Now they were waiting to see what the results might be. Joanne couldn't keep her legs still. She bounced them nervously, even when Mackenzie told her to stop. Deep down, Joanne was worried that something could be seriously wrong with her daughter. Thankfully, it was not long before the doctor popped her head into the waiting room and waved Mackenzie back. Joanne followed, and they stepped into the same little examination room where they'd first met the doctor. The doctor told Mackenzie that all of her tests had come back negative. In her opinion, it seemed like Mackenzie's system was just being sensitive to the food she'd been eating over the summer, which explained the stomach pain and the weight loss. Her stomach should settle down in the coming weeks, and then she could regain the weight, and so the doctor just advised some rest at home. Joanne felt incredibly relieved as she promised the doctor that she would heed the advice, she would get her daughter some rest and some good home-cooked meals. And Mackenzie nodded as well, agreeing to take it easy until school started later in the month. And with that, Joanne decided to put her worries aside and focus on enjoying some quality time with her daughter before she returned to college in Boston. A few weeks later, Mackenzie sat at a large table in a wood-paneled dining hall, having dinner with some friends. She was back at Harvard, enjoying the beginning of her sophomore year. But she was still dangerously underweight, and her stomach ached every time she took so much as a small bite of food. Determined to eat anyways, she shoved a little bit of pasta into her mouth, and she chewed it until it basically dissolved inside of her mouth, and then she swallowed. Then she braced herself. Sure enough, a few minutes later, that stabbing pain erupted in her stomach. A friend noticed Mackenzie go silent and asked if everything was okay. Mackenzie just nodded and said the pain would subside in a few minutes. But 10 minutes later, the pain was only getting worse. Breathless, Mackenzie asked her friend to walk her back to her dorm room. She wanted to go lie down. The friend agreed, and they made their way across the quad from the dining hall to her dorm room. Once there, Mackenzie crawled into her bed and just lay in a fetal position, waiting for the stabbing sensation to go away. But it didn't. She was in too much pain to move, and so she stayed in bed for hours, just watching reruns of Friends and holding her stomach. The pain would finally ease up, at which point she was able to sit upright. Mackenzie went to the bathroom to brush her teeth, then tried to get some sleep. 2 weeks later, Mackenzie was in the emergency room, holding her stomach in agony. After 2 weeks of near constant stabbing pain, Mackenzie had finally gone to the student health center on campus. But she had been so underweight when she arrived that the staff didn't think they'd be able to treat her. Instead, they called an ambulance to take her to the hospital where she was now. A doctor walked into the room and pulled up a stool so that she was sitting directly across from Mackenzie. And then she leaned in, looking as though she had some bad news. The doctor explained that Mackenzie weighed only 75 pounds, which was a life-threatening weight for someone who was 5 feet 3 inches tall. The doctor said it was a good thing that Mackenzie had gone to the student health clinic for help. She might not have made it much longer on her own. The thought was terrifying. Mackenzie could feel her heart start to race as the doctor ordered a full workup of tests and then promised they would get to the bottom of her pain. Mackenzie called her parents to let them know what was going on, and her mom said she'd booked the next flight out of Sacramento. Mackenzie wanted to tell her mom that she was overreacting, that everything would be fine, but for the first time since she got sick, she didn't know if that was even true. This thought made her eyes sting with tears, and she begged her mom to please hurry up. When the doctor returned a few hours later, she wasn't alone. There was a small medical team with her, who told Mackenzie they had her test results. Mackenzie braced herself, hoping for something definitive. Instead, the doctors explained that all of Mackenzie's tests had come back normal. Mackenzie was shocked. She certainly did not feel normal, but then the doctor went on. Because her tests were normal, it was likely her weight loss was due to a psychological issue, not a physical one. So instead of surgery or medication, they wanted to send her to an inpatient treatment center, specifically one that specialized in eating disorders. Mackenzie blinked. Sure, she had just heard the doctor wrong. She didn't have an eating disorder. In fact, she was desperately trying to eat. But the doctor just shook her head and said that while that might seem true, Mackenzie's extreme weight loss and the fact that she sometimes skipped meals altogether pointed to a diagnosis of anorexia. Mackenzie tried to keep herself together, to convince them that she only skipped meals because of the physical pain in her stomach, but the doctors were certain that she was just struggling with an eating disorder. An hour later, Mackenzie felt so relieved when her mother walked into her hospital room. She began crying and then started trying to explain what the doctors had said to her, because she knew her mother would believe her. She would set the doctors straight. Instead, her mom sat on the edge of the bed and told Mackenzie that the inpatient center was probably best. They had to trust the doctors. They knew what they were doing. Mackenzie felt overwhelmed as she realized what her mother was saying, that she would be going to the treatment facility in a matter of hours to have her mental health examined. A month later, Mackenzie sat at a metal lunch table with a nurse sitting nearby. Mackenzie forced herself to eat the food in front of her, even though every bite felt like molten iron hitting her stomach. She'd spent the past 4 weeks in a medical unit for people with eating disorders and had been observed at mealtimes like this one on a regular basis. She choked down as much food as she could handle, knowing that she was not going to be released until she gained back some of the weight she'd lost over the summer. Her stomach now hurt all the time, and not just when she was eating. It now hurt to walk, to sleep, to move, just to think it hurt. And the worst part was that everybody kept telling her it was all in her head. She felt unhinged and angry. Angry that her doctors didn't believe her. Angry that she was missing school to be in this medical unit. And angry that she was in too much pain to eat. She felt like she was going crazy. She finished the last bite of her oatmeal and dropped her spoon in triumph. The nurse told her she had done a great job, then followed her to the small office where Mackenzie weighed in every few days. She stepped on a digital scale, and the nurse took down her weight from a screen that Mackenzie couldn't see. Blind weigh-ins were clinic policy because they didn't want the patients thinking about how much they weighed. But Mackenzie wanted to know. She was praying that she'd managed to put more weight on. Her clothes had been fitting her better, which she hoped was a good sign. Mackenzie sighed with relief when the nurse looked at her weight on the screen and then told her that she should be proud of her efforts. Mackenzie's stomach was already aching from the oatmeal she'd just eaten, but she refused to show it. She would do anything to leave this place and return to school. And if that meant she had to bear down and hide the agony she suffered every time she swallowed food, well, that was fine. Five months later, in the spring of 2011, Mackenzie sat upright in a bed at a medical facility while a nurse took her vitals. Mackenzie's parents waited anxiously by her side. Thankfully, Mackenzie's weight had stabilized, which allowed her to move back home with her parents back in Nevada City. But eating was still extremely painful, and Mackenzie knew that if she didn't do something to fix it, her weight could plummet right back down again. So now, a doctor was about to insert a permanent feeding tube through Mackenzie's nose and down her throat. It was a radical idea, but Mackenzie's gastroenterologist thought it might help her maintain her weight. Nutrients would now bypass her hypersensitive stomach altogether and instead go directly to her small intestine. From now on, Mackenzie would have to navigate the world with a tube in her nose. But the doctor thought it might help her gut rest for a while and alleviate the pain, which could allow Mackenzie to go back to school. And to Mackenzie, that was worth the risk. The nurse finished taking her vitals, and a few minutes later, the doctor came in and got all the equipment ready. Mackenzie smiled at her parents as the doctor inserted the tube up her nose, down her esophagus, and into her small intestine. Her mom asked her how she was feeling. Mackenzie had to be honest. Not great. But at least she wasn't having stabbing pains in her stomach, and hopefully it would all be upwards from here. A few weeks later, Mackenzie arrived at her gastroenterologist's office for a routine checkup. She stepped on the scale, which flashed 105 pounds. It was phenomenal news. She'd officially regained all the weight she'd lost since first going to Rwanda. Mackenzie was overjoyed. And then it got even better when her gastroenterologist told her he was officially ruling out anorexia as a diagnosis, and he was approving Mackenzie to return to college in the fall. Now, the gastroenterologist was clear. They still didn't know what was causing Mackenzie so much pain, but at the very least, it didn't have to stop her from living her life. Mackenzie was too excited to care at that moment. She could not wait to get home and re-enroll at Harvard. In early September of 2011, Mackenzie sat in a dining hall with her friends for the first time in a year. She couldn't have been happier to be back on campus, even if it meant that she was now a year behind her classmates. Mackenzie was getting all of her food through the nasal feeding tube now, and while that normally didn't bother her, it was Taco Tuesday at the dining hall, and her stomach almost grumbled as she smelled the chili peppers and grilled onions. She didn't miss the stomach pain, but some days she really missed eating. And she also didn't like the feeling that everybody was always looking at her. She was the nose tube girl, and she felt even more conspicuous when she was sitting next to friends at the dining hall. So she took out a textbook, deciding to get a jump start on her homework while her friends ate. Their mouths were too full to talk anyway. Mackenzie had a full course load this semester, and she'd volunteered to work at a local homeless shelter. So really, she told herself, cutting out the time it took to actually eat meals was for the best. Just then, one of her friends asked her if she wanted to try just a little bit of the churros they were serving for dessert, and Mackenzie did. She really did. But she still shook her head no. She told her friend that she was enjoying her life and that really this was no big deal. But the friend frowned, not quite believing her, and then went back to eating. As for Mackenzie, she sighed and went back to her homework. The following summer, in July of 2012, Mackenzie stood in line at a burger shack outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. She was spending the summer volunteering again, this time on Native American reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. She was thrilled to be back in the field, and best of all, she no longer had a feeding tube coming out of her nose. She stepped up to the counter and handed the cashier a list of orders. She apologized for the large volume. The food was for a clinic full of hungry doctors waiting on burgers and chicken sandwiches. But none of this food was for Mackenzie. Even though she no longer had a nasal feeding tube, she still wasn't eating. That May, surgeons had given her a stomach feeding tube that was less conspicuous than the one in her nose. They'd also removed her gallbladder to avoid the risk of gallstones, hoping that would relieve her pain somewhat. But her new feeding tube delivered nutrition to her stomach, and so she was getting those stabbing stomach pains again, even now as she stood outside the burger shack. They weren't as bad or as prolonged as when she actually ate food, but still, it hurt. Mackenzie stood around the parking lot, waiting for her order to be up, and checking her watch. She was waiting for a phone consultation with her gastroenterologist, who she still checked in with routinely, and today she had a special request. She wanted to know when she could go back to volunteering in Africa. She had gotten used to not eating, but she was tired of letting her stomach pain rule her life. She wanted clearance to go back overseas. Just then, Mackenzie picked up the burgers, and a few minutes later, her doctor called. Mackenzie updated him on how she was doing, and then she asked for clearance to go back to work in Africa. The doctor paused for a moment to think, and then finally he said yes. He thought it would be okay for her to go. Mackenzie was so happy. She thanked the doctor, hung up, and jumped in her car. As soon as she had a free moment, she would start making plans. Two years later, in the summer of 2014, Mackenzie's mom, Joanne, was on a hike with her husband, Wayne. It was a dry, hot day in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, and Joanne could see Wayne, who was a little ahead of her on the trail, pouring some of their water over his head to cool off. Joanne was lagging behind him because she was in deep conversation with a fellow hiker. She was telling her new friend about her daughter, and he was nodding his head as Joanne described Mackenzie's struggle to live a full life despite her illness. Because this fellow hiker, whom she just met, happened to be a doctor at the University of California at San Francisco who specialized in advocating for patients with complex medical cases. Joanne explained that Mackenzie was currently in South Africa, volunteering after she graduated from Harvard in May. Her doctors had been reluctant to let her go, but said if she really felt called to return to Africa, well, South Africa would be okay. The doctor that Joanne was talking to on the trail raised his eyebrows and admitted that he was impressed. Mackenzie sounded like a really special person. He asked if he and a medical student could contact Mackenzie. He was currently teaching a course on medical advocacy, and Mackenzie's case sounded like an ideal mystery to investigate. Joanne couldn't hide her excitement. For the first time in 5 years, it felt like maybe, just maybe, they would get some real answers here. The moment Joanne and Wayne got back to their car, Joanne texted her daughter in South Africa, telling her all about the chance encounter with this doctor. A few weeks later, a medical student named Jessica Gould sat next to the professor Joanne had met on the hiking trail. They were about to join a Skype call with Mackenzie. Jessica had been helping her professor look over Mackenzie's case and devise questions and theories that might guide their Skype call, and so she felt prepared for this, but in all honesty, Jessica was nervous. She had read how many specialists had worked with Mackenzie, and she didn't know what she, a fourth-year medical student, could offer. There was a ding on the computer, and Mackenzie appeared on the screen. She was thin, almost frail, and looked impossibly tired, and not from a bad night of sleep, but from years of exhaustion. Despite that, she was smiling and waving, her brown hair pulled into a messy bun on the top of her head. Jessica admired Mackenzie's determination. She hoped there was some way they could help her. She and her professor said hello, and the more they spoke with Mackenzie, the more inspired Jessica became by her. She thought about how Mackenzie approached her chronic illness. Despite her constant pain, Mackenzie still found ways to help others thousands of miles from home. And so if Mackenzie could find ways to help others, well, Jessica could find a way to help Mackenzie. Several months later, Jessica was sitting in front of her laptop, as always, feeling exhausted. She was on a phone call with her professor, explaining that she still hadn't figured out what was wrong with Mackenzie. She was frustrated. She'd spent nearly every minute of her free time chasing down leads, devouring thousands of pages of records from different hospitals, and searching through medical databases, anything that could help her find a way to help Mackenzie Hild. But every lead she chased met a dead end. It was maddening, and she told her professor as much. He just sighed and was silent for a long moment. Then, he suggested Jessica go back and look at the more common diseases that all of Mackenzie's specialists had ruled out. Maybe Jessica's fresh perspective would unearth some clue these specialists had missed. Jessica doubted that she would find something that the country's top doctors had overlooked, but she didn't have any other leads to pursue, so she agreed. A few weeks later, in January 2015, Mackenzie was lounging on the couch back home in Nevada City when her phone rang. When she answered, the man who spoke to her was Dr. Christopher Skelly, the chief of vascular surgery at the University of Chicago Medical Center. Dr. Skelly explained that before the holidays, he'd received an interesting email from a medical student named Jessica Gould. And after chatting with Jessica, he had agreed to review Mackenzie's case. And in his opinion, he knew what was causing Mackenzie's pain and had a way to treat it. Mackenzie's heart pounded. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. For the past 6 years, she'd either been living in excruciating pain or with a feeding tube up her nose or in her stomach. It had been 5 years since she last chewed food or even tasted it. She thought this was how she would live the rest of her life. She'd grieved, she'd processed, she'd found a way to move on. And now she was hearing that there might be a cure. She told Dr. Skelly that she couldn't book her ticket to Chicago quickly enough. 4 weeks later, Mackenzie arrived at Dr. Skelly's office feeling nervous and thrilled. After some testing, Dr. Skelly told Mackenzie that he believed her symptoms were physical, not psychological. In fact, he believed she had been suffering for years because of a physical abnormality that she'd had since birth. And the tests proved it. Just hearing those words flooded Mackenzie with relief. She wanted to cry. Then Dr. Skelly finally gave her an official diagnosis. He said that Mackenzie had a rare and little-known condition called median arcuate ligament syndrome, or MALS for short. He explained that the median arcuate ligament is a band of tissue that runs from the base of the diaphragm, the muscles that help us breathe, up to the heart. For people with MALS, that band of tissue is in the wrong place. It crosses over the heart and compresses the artery that supplies blood to the stomach and other organs. This impaired blood flow can cause intense pain when eating because the stomach isn't getting the blood supply it needs to digest the food. Doctors had actually tested Mackenzie for MALS early on, but those results came back negative. However, when Jessica went back and reviewed the early decisions in Mackenzie's case, she thought MALS perfectly explained Mackenzie's symptoms. And so Jessica had convinced a leading expert on MALS, Dr. Skelly, to investigate whether her hunch was right. And when he did, Dr. Skelly determined that the previous tests were wrong. Mackenzie did have MALS after all. On March 18, 2015, Dr. Skelly performed a 2.5-hour surgery on Mackenzie to relieve the pressure on the artery supplying blood to her stomach. The next day, when Mackenzie woke up, she had her first bite of food in 5 years, a spoonful of scrambled eggs from the hospital cafeteria. She chewed, she swallowed, and then she waited, and no pain came, and she burst into tears of joy. It would take a few weeks for her stomach to get used to eating, but the pain never did come back. After recovering from MALS syndrome, Mackenzie went on to attend medical school at the University of Washington in Seattle. It turned out that he had physically torn his vocal cords from screaming incessantly. In the height of World War II, Russian scientists wanted to find a way to keep their soldiers awake longer. And so they devised this experiment, this human experiment, to test the effects of extreme sleep deprivation. And so what they did is they rounded up 5 prisoners of war and offered them their freedom if they went through this experiment, which I can tell you went sideways. And so the way it worked is they were going to be put inside of this sealed gas chamber that continuously was going to administer this stimulant gas. It was an experimental stimulant gas. This is not something they knew much about, but they were fairly confident that it wouldn't kill them and that it would keep them awake. And so they put them inside the chamber and they started administering the gas. This was not at a time where they had closed circuit cameras. Those weren't around at the time. All they had was, they could put microphones in there, and they had these 5-inch thick little porthole windows. They had one porthole window where the researchers could look into the chamber itself. So the experiment begins, and really for the first 3-4 days, everything was pretty normal. At about the day 4 mark, the researchers started to notice a change in what they were discussing, the subjects. It went from kind of small talk over those first few days to fairly dark. They started talking almost exclusively about traumatic events that had happened to them in their life. And around the day 4 mark is when the subjects started complaining about being in this test at all. The first few days it was filled with some optimism that this was their ticket out of the terrible situation they were in. And then it really turned into, this is a terrible situation. I think it was around the day 6 mark, the subjects stopped talking to each other completely. They became paranoid of the other subjects, and they went to their own sections of the chamber. And in the chamber they had places to sit, there was food, there was water, there was a bathroom, there was books in there to read. They kind of took up space inside of the chamber. They began to believe that they could kind of like sell out their comrades in exchange for getting out of this experiment. So they would, one by one come up to the porthole or go over to one of the microphones that was obviously placed inside the chamber and start whispering these kind of imagined offenses of the other subjects to try to get them in trouble in exchange for being released from this experiment, which, that didn't do anything. The researchers, they didn't care what they said. They just listened and watched. After 9 days, the experiment took a significant turn for the worst. It was the morning of I think it was the 10th day, where the screaming began. One of the test subjects began screaming. And at this point, everybody is totally segregated. They're not talking to each other. They're muttering and whispering. And one of them just starts screaming. And so for 3 hours, they watch him scream at the top of his lungs and run back and forth across this little chamber until he stopped screaming, but he's still running. And they could kind of pick up on the microphone that he was still making sound, but it was like these little squeaks. It turned out that he had physically torn his vocal cords from screaming incessantly. The other subjects didn't react to the screaming at all. It was like it wasn't happening, but they're in this confined space, right? It's like so loud in there. And all that happened is, as he's screaming, the other subjects began ripping out pages of the book, soaking them, and then pushing them up against the porthole glass, obscuring the view. So by the time the subject who had torn his vocal cords stopped, by the time he tore his vocal cords and it went quiet, the researchers couldn't actually see into the chamber anymore. And once the guy had torn his vocal cords, there was no more sound in the room. So their view was obscured, and now it's gone silent. After 3 days of talking about what they're going to do, of complete silence in the room. They can't see in, it's silent. They're monitoring the oxygen levels in the room, and based on oxygen consumption in the room, apparently they could tell that there were people in there, probably at least 4 or 5, that were breathing oxygen because it was being consumed. So they believed they were alive, but after 3 days of silence, which really didn't make any sense, they determined that, either our microphones are broken, and that's a problem, or there's something wrong with the subjects themselves. So they decide that they're going to use the intercom to reach out to the subjects and basically tell them that they're gonna come into the room. Hey, we're gonna test the microphones. We're gonna be coming into the chamber. You need to lay on the ground and not interact with us. If you comply, we will offer one of you immediate release and freedom. So there's silence after they use the intercom. They decide to do that. They talk through the intercom, and one of the subjects, now to this point again, for 3 days it's been silent. And one of the subjects, clear as can be, talks into the microphone and just says, "We no longer want to be freed." And so the researchers were like, okay, I guess they're alive and our microphones work, so they don't go in. They stay out of the chamber. Silence continues all the way up until the 15th day because, you know, the window's still obscured. The subjects are not speaking, they're not muttering, they're not whispering, it's just silence. And on the 15th day, at midnight on the 15th day, they decide that the experiment was over. And so what they did is they flushed the room of the stimulant that had been continuously pouring into the room. They turned that off and they replaced it with fresh air. And that's when they started hearing the screaming from the subjects inside of the chamber. They were begging them, the researchers, to turn the gas back on, pleading with them, like begging, please turn it back on, as if they were dying. And then they opened the chamber, and now they're laying eyes on the chamber for the first time since like the 10th day. So it's been like 5 days. And they're seeing the chamber with their own eyes for the first time, and it's straight out of a horror scene. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive. The 5th subject, who had perished at some point, there was chunks of flesh that had been taken off of his chest and his leg and had been jammed into the drain in the center of the room. And they had turned on the water in the bathroom and had flooded the room. There was almost 4 inches of water on the ground, like murky, stagnant, like, you know, lots of gross stuff in their water all over the ground. And there's this dead subject. And all 4 of them have also, there's chunks of their own flesh that's been ripped off of their body. And it was later determined that it was self-inflicted, these chunks of meat that had been pulled off of them. And it was not by teeth either, it was by hand. And also they were eating it. So they were ripping off pieces of their body and eating it. The food storage that was down there hadn't been touched in days. It was like they had all completely lost their mind and began eating themselves. These subjects did not want to leave the chamber. They just continued to beg for the gas to be turned back on. And so finally they brought in some soldiers to actually extract the living subjects out of the chamber, but they fought so aggressively to stay there. And in fact, one of the subjects jumped up and bit the neck of one of the soldiers, and he actually bled to death. Also, one of the subjects in the struggle, his spleen ruptured and he bled to death. So now you have 2 casualties just getting them out of the room. They finally get the 3 remaining subjects, living subjects, out of the room, and they heavily restrain them. They bring them to a medical facility because they need to go under surgery because they've had chunks of their own flesh ripped off. They're totally emaciated. And the most injured of the 3 is immediately brought into surgery, while the other 2 were just kind of held in a holding room. And they try to give him a sedative in order to prepare him for surgery. This is not the anesthetic, this is just the sedative. And it's like he's immune to it. You know, they give him the sedative, it does nothing. And he's just like resisting them, and he keeps begging to go back under the gas. And then finally they say, okay, well, we're just going to give him the anesthetic now. And when they bring it out and they tell him, we're going to give you an anesthetic and we're going to give you the surgery, he starts viciously fighting back. He does not want the anesthetic. He's pleading for them not to give him the anesthetic, that he must remain awake. He needs to remain awake, put me back under the gas. And in his struggle to not have the anesthetic given to him, he manages to tear one of the leather straps that was holding him down. So like an extreme amount of force. And then finally, when they give him the anesthetic, and they had to give him like 10 times the dosage or whatever just to get him to calm down, as soon as he fell asleep, he died. So after he passes away, they move on to the next worse off subject, the guy who had torn his vocal cords and couldn't speak. They bring him in for surgery, and he can't speak, but he's shaking his head because he doesn't want the anesthetic, he doesn't want to go under surgery, and he's fighting with them, and he actually just passes out from exhaustion. And he too, once he falls asleep, or I guess falls unconscious, he dies as well. So now there's only 1 subject left. The other 2 that had lived to be pulled out of the chamber have now died as soon as they fell asleep, and the scientists don't have any idea why. Instead of bringing the last survivor into surgery, because now they've witnessed 2 surgeries end in death, they decide, let's put this guy back in the chamber and turn the gas back on, because apparently that's the one thing that's keeping these guys alive. And so in preparation for being put back into the chamber, they hooked him up with an EEG that basically measures your brain waves, which I guess they hadn't done to this point in the experiment. And so they put him in there, and the scientists are watching the readout of the EEG, and they noticed that like his lines would just, inexplicably flatline and then go back to up and down and then flatline again. And one of them had the wherewithal to look at the subject as it's flatlining, and they could see that every time he closed his eyes, it was like he was micro sleeping, like these little blinks. Basically, every time he fell asleep for like a fraction of a second, it was like he was suffering a brain death over and over and over again. And as they're monitoring this, and they know what just happened to the other two, they died when they fell asleep. They're trying to rush to get the gas turned back on to keep this guy alive, but they didn't do it in time, and he eventually succumbs and falls asleep. And they can see before he ultimately dies that initially when he finally fell asleep, the EEG showed that he had fallen into a deep sleep. And then he flatlined and his heart stopped and he died. All of the subjects died, and no one really knows what killed them. Was it the sleep deprivation? Was it the gas? It could be a mixture of the two, but we'll never know. But either way, all of them died. Now, this is actually just a story, and there's no evidence to suggest that it's even true. But during that time frame in the 40s, during World War II, there were known cases of horrific, unethical human experimentation happening, like in the Japanese, that awful Unit 731. I would not suggest Googling that unless you got a really strong stomach. You had in the concentration camps, the German concentration camps, human experimentation was definitely happening. And obviously Germany and Japan are not Russia, but it was just in this era where human experimentation was definitely happening. So even if this particular story, the Russian sleep experiment, is not true, I wouldn't be shocked in the least if there wasn't a similar study done somewhere. Obviously, the results could vary dramatically, but I do think that it's certainly possible that something like this could have happened. We continue to study sleep and sleep deprivation, and really there's not much known about it. We don't even really know why we sleep. But we do know that you will die if you go without sleep. I think the longest any human went without sleep was like 18 days. And I can actually speak from my own experience. I was a Navy SEAL for 7 years, and we go through something called Hell Week in initial training, where over a period of 5.5 days, you sleep for a total of 4 hours. Not every night 4 hours, but a grand total of 4 hours. And it's split up into two little chunks, 2 hours and 2 hours. And then there's like a 15-minute and 15-minute nap thrown in there too. And you really just lose your mind after 72 hours. I remember I was constantly hallucinating that when I was around my classmates, their head would turn into a big Rubik's Cube and start flipping around. And even when I got right next to them, their head would still be flopping around like a Rubik's Cube. And that's only 72 hours in. I can only imagine what would happen at 15 days. So that's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed my version of the Russian sleep experiment. Go check it out on Creepypasta or just Google Russian sleep experiment. There's loads of stuff on the internet about it. If you're not already, do check me out on TikTok. So my handle on TikTok is the same as my YouTube handle. It's MrBallen. I post videos in there daily. Lots of horror stuff, scary stuff. If you're into that, go check it out. Also, I have an Instagram, John B. Allen 416 is my handle there. More Navy SEAL content on there, but if you're interested in that, go check it out. And that's going to do it. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Let me know if you want to hear other stories that you think I'd do a good job telling. Let me know, and I'll see if I can do it. And that's going to do it. Thanks, guys. Working at this paper mill for 20 years, and he was reaching up to get something on a shelf when he threw his back out. And in fact, he had slipped a number of discs, and it ultimately meant he was not able to work anymore. He was going to be disabled. And so he's suddenly out of work. His wife, Shelly Martin, was not working at the time, but when he couldn't work, she needed to get a job. And so Shelly, who had not worked in a long time, was able, through some connections, to land a job in her hometown in Maine called Palmyra. Palmyra was a very small rural community. I mean, we're talking maybe 1,200 people that lived there. They also had a 17-year-old daughter named Chelsea who was not eager to go, but but it was the only place they could afford, and so they had to go. Luckily, because Palmyra was such a cheap place to live relative to where they had been living, that for less money, they actually ended up getting a bigger piece of property than they had lived in before. It's this beautiful farmhouse that sat on a whole bunch of acreage, but it was incredibly isolated. You had to go down this bumpy access road to get to their long driveway, and then once you were on the property, you'd look out and it was just a full 360 degrees of very dense forest that virtually no one was in. There was no nature trails. It was just dark, dense forest everywhere you looked. So even though no one's that happy about it, they end up moving into this farmhouse, and as they're unpacking their truck, Eric picks up one of his many rifles that he owned. Eric came from a long line of hunters. He loved to hunt. It was his favorite thing to do, and he had a whole bunch of guns that he kept. And as he's carrying the rifle into the house, Shelley says, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house. You have a barn, you're gonna put your guns in there." This had always been a point of contention for them in their marriage. Shelley just didn't feel safe having guns in the house, especially having kids in there. And so ultimately Eric agrees, okay, fine, I won't put my guns in the house. I'll put them in the barn. And so he went in the barn, and he and his son, Sean, who he had come out to help him, they built this gun case for all of his rifles. It was very heavy duty. They put it in the barn, and then they locked that and then locked the barn itself. So they were totally secure in the barn, but definitely not readily accessible. Over that first year, Shelley and Eric developed this ritual where at the end of the day, they would go out on the front porch of their farmhouse and look out onto the front yard, and they would drink coffee. It was something they both looked forward to, and virtually every night they did this. And so almost exactly a year after moving in, it was in early 2006, Shelley and Eric are sitting on their front porch, enjoying their coffee, they're chatting, and Shelley thinks she sees something in the woods. Now, you have to understand the layout and how far away they are from the woods to get a sense of what they were seeing. Right in front of their porch was a gravel road where they parked their cars. About 20 meters away from their house to the left is their barn, and beyond the barn, basically straight out from the porch, is this huge open field where there's no trees or anything. It was like open grazing area. And then way beyond the field was the beginning of this tree line, of this really dense forest. So we're talking at least a couple hundred meters away where she sees these lights. And she described it as like a pulsating light. It did not look like a car or some sort of vehicle, not to mention there was no road out straight ahead from their porch. It was just a dense forest where there was absolutely no one that should have been in there. Eric immediately, when he sees the lights, he thinks there's a poacher on his property, someone illegally hunting on his property. And so he gets Sean, his son, who did not live with them but was staying the night that night, he gets him to come outside and say, "Hey, do you think that's a poacher down there at the edge of our tree line?" And Sean's like, "I don't know, maybe." Eric decides that he wants to go tell this person to leave his property, and so he asks Sean to come with him. They figured they would just get to the edge of the property and yell out, "Hey, this is private property, you need to leave." As they're walking across the field and they're getting closer to the tree line, the lights, those pulsating lights, begin to fade and disappear back into the woods. And they get all the way up to the tree line and they can't see any lights at all. Even though at this point, standing on the edge of the forest, Eric and Sean are fairly confident that this poacher has left, they decide, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods. Even though it's totally dark, we're not going to get lost. We'll walk a little ways into the woods and just continue to yell, "This is private property," so they really do leave. And so they begin walking, and it's a very dense forest, lots of low-hanging limbs. It's not somewhere that's easy to walk. There's no walking trails or anything like that. And they walk, 10, 15 meters into the woods, and then they hear what sounds like someone walking parallel to them, maybe 15 meters away from them on their left. And they both stop and they look. They didn't want to take any chance that they were being stalked by a predator. And so they thought, you know what? The lights are gone. I don't know what animal this is. Let's just get out of here. About a month goes by, and Nathan, who is Chelsea's boyfriend, was staying with the family at the farm. And it was the first nice spring day. I mean, it was a very dark and dreary winter. Maine winters tend to be that way. And so that weekend, Nathan and Chelsea decide, let's go walk around the woods. So they take the two family dogs and they start walking across that big field in front of the house into the forest, the same area where Sean and Eric have been looking for those lights and then heard what sounded like an animal that was near them. And so at first, Chelsea has the dogs on leashes, but they get to the forest and she lets them off their leash to let them go run around and go crazy because they've been cooped up because of the wintertime as well. The two dogs instantly take off running for about 100 meters, and then they come to a dead stop right outside this big mound. It looks like a dirt mound, but they get up close to it and they can tell that it's actually more like a den. There are these huge pieces of wood that have been leaned into like a lean-to type structure. with moss and dirt and grass put all over the outside. I mean, it looks like a very intentionally made mound. And there's a circular hole that's been created right on the front of it. And the dogs have stopped right outside and they're poking their heads in and smelling into this hole. And Nathan and Chelsea are looking at this thinking, who did this? Is this like a hunter's thing? Is this something a hunter might make? Would an animal make this? This seems really big for some animal to make this, but it definitely was made on purpose, whatever it is. And so Nathan, he just kind of looks down into this den, but it's totally dark, and he thinks he hears growling coming from inside of the den. And so without any hesitation, he goes, we gotta go. I don't know what's living in there, but we gotta go. And so they take the dogs, they put them back on leashes, and the two of them get out of the forest as quickly as they can. When Nathan and Chelsea came back to the house, they told Eric and Shelly, and actually Sean was there too, and they said, hey, we found this den of some kind out in the middle of the woods, basically straight out from your front porch. And that's when Eric and Sean said, well, about a month ago, we were out in that same area, and we could have sworn we heard some animal stalking us. A couple of months go by, and Eric and Shelly are sitting on their front porch having their coffee ritual, and there was just this low mist that kind of hung over the entire field. And as they're sitting there, they're commenting on how creepy it was. And what started as just kind of a friendly discussion about the general creepiness took a turn when they realized that they couldn't hear any wildlife. No crickets, no animals, no anything. And normally at night, because they were out here all the time, it was humming with life. And so Shelly had this high-powered flashlight that she always had out with her, and she starts scanning the property, not knowing what she's looking for, but it just seemed really odd that they couldn't hear any wildlife. But after she scans across the whole field, she doesn't see anything, and so she puts her flashlight down and just starts talking to Eric about whatever they normally talked about over coffee at night. Eric would say in numerous interviews that for whatever reason, when she put that flashlight down, he suddenly felt like they were in danger. He's looking out, he doesn't see anything, and then all of a sudden he just says, you know what? We gotta go inside. I don't know what it is, but we gotta go inside. And Shelly's like, come on, I wanna stay out here for a little bit longer. We'll go in a few minutes. And Eric stands up and he's like, no, go inside. And he tries to grab her to kind of push her into the house. And she's kind of fighting against him. And then all of a sudden, Shelly stops. And she goes, did you hear that? And Eric immediately knew that whatever it was, it's the reason he had that sudden feeling of being in danger. Eric turns around and he can't see anything because it's too dark. Shelly grabs her flashlight and she begins scanning the tree line. And she gets to the field and gets about halfway across the field right in front of them, and she stops. Because right in the middle of the field are three creatures that look like wolves. These huge creatures that are looking right at them. Two others join them. So there's 5 wolf-like creatures that are staring at them right from the middle of their field. She says to Eric, what are those? And Eric, who's an experienced hunter, he has no idea. He goes, I think they're bears. They could be wolves. We gotta go inside. And so Shelly's just holding the light and they start charging directly at her so fast that she wasn't able to keep the light on them. They were already halfway across the field. They go inside, they shut the door and they lock it. And without saying a word, the two of them make their rounds across the entire bottom floor, lock every window, close every blind, make sure everything is shut. There was something different about these 5 creatures. The way they started running towards them, it just felt like they were targeting Eric and Shelly. And so even after the house had been secured, they didn't feel safe. And so they're standing in the middle of their cabin and Eric's saying, my guns are in the barn. We have no protection. And Shelly is like, whatever you do, do not go out there. We don't know what these are. It could be a bear, it could be a wolf, we don't know. Don't go out there. Shelly goes upstairs, she shuts off all the lights, she makes sure all the windows are shut. And then she goes to Chelsea's room, her daughter, and she wakes her up and she says, hey, come here, you gotta look at this. And they go to the window and they kind of like poke their head into the window because they don't want to like totally open it up and stare out because they don't want the creatures to see them. But they're kind of poking their head out the window and she's like, look. And standing on the gravel are these 5 creatures that are just standing in a row looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting for them to come out the front door. They were just patiently standing there looking at the house. It did not look like normal animal behavior at all. And as she's looking, one of the animals looks up at Shelly in the window, and the creature stands on its 2 legs. It gets on its hind legs and looks at her, and Shelly gasps and falls over because the creature's like 8 feet tall. And so Shelly's on the ground looking at Chelsea, and she can't believe what she just saw. It's like her brain can't process that this creature, one, had even seen her. They barely had their head up in the window. But that it stood on its hind legs, that it was so big. What are they doing? Sitting in a row right on the outside of the house waiting for us? What's going on here? And so Shelly tells Chelsea, get in your bed, don't go to your windows, don't leave this room. And that's when Shelly also remembers that she hasn't heard her 2 dogs. and she's worried they might be outside. And so she starts quietly walking all along the top floor looking for her dog. She's calling to her 2 dogs, and they don't come out. Goes into the master bedroom and finds her 2 dogs hiding in the corner of the room next to each other. Like they're startled by whatever it is outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs thinking he needed to go to the barn and he needed to get his guns to protect the family. But he knew that between his own disability, he can barely walk very fast, and he'd have to unlock the barn, and then he'd have to pull down the gun case, unlock that. All the while, he's exposed to these animals that are out there. And so the next best thing in his mind is maybe he could run outside, get in his truck, and back the truck up to the front door, and then he could get his wife and his daughter to come out, jump in the car, and they could drive away. So he just goes to the window and he pulls the blinds aside to look outside, and those 5 creatures are now gone. They're not sitting on the gravel path right in front of the house. He doesn't know where they are, but they're not in front of the house. And so he closes the blinds and he's like, well, I don't know where they are. It's too dangerous to go out there. He starts pacing some more and he goes back to look, and he sees them back in the field where they first saw them, all 5. You can see all 5. They're facing the house still, but he can see them because the moon has now popped through and he's got illumination on the field, and he can see all 5. And he's like, okay, maybe if I just keep my eye on them, I can open the door, run out, get the car, back it up without them seeing me. And so without telling Shelly, he opens the door and he goes onto the front porch and he sees them out in the field. He's got a good line of sight on them. Quiet as he can, he walks down the steps and he makes his way over to his truck, which is about 10 meters away. And as he's getting closer and closer to his truck, he's got his eye on the creatures that are in the field. They haven't moved. They apparently haven't seen him. He gets to the driver's side of his truck and he's got his keys out and he's kind of fumbling to hit the unlock button, and then his motion sensor light kicks on. And he's so on edge being out there, when the light kicks on, he drops his keys because he's so startled. And the first thing he does, he looks towards the field and he sees that one of the 5 creatures is now standing on its hind legs looking at him directly. Before he even bends down to get his keys, he sees them all running towards him. He reaches down, he grabs his keys, he runs back to the house as fast as he can, and he gets inside and slams it right as he can hear them crossing the gravel right in front of the house. And he hears them bound onto the porch and start running around the wraparound porch. He's too scared to even look in the window, so he ducks down to get out of view. Shelly, who was upstairs, can hear everything going on, and she yells, Eric, what's going on? And he goes, stay up there, stay up there. Shelly, Eric, Chelsea, everyone's just frozen, waiting, knowing that these creatures are right on the other side, walking along his wraparound porch. And after a while, he hears the footsteps of these creatures leave the porch and go back onto the gravel area. And at some point, he pokes his head up and he looks, and all 5 are sitting there just facing the house, waiting for them to come out of the house. And so he scurries up the stairs to where Shelly and Chelsea are, and they just are so scared. So they decide they gotta call the police. If nothing else, the police will drive up and their vehicle might scare away these creatures. But on the phone, Shelly lets on that what they're really scared about is something on their property. In fact, it's 5 creatures, things running around outside their property. And immediately the police officer who's responding to this, he's like, all right, well, are you sure it's not a moose? Are you sure it's not a bear? And finally, she's like, no, can you please just come over here? And he's like, listen, ma'am, just keep your door shut, keep your windows shut, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And ultimately, that's how the call ends. They're on their own. The family felt helpless. And Eric especially felt really frustrated because he can't protect his family. He doesn't have a weapon. He can't get to his vehicle. They're just trapped. And so they decide the only thing we can do is barricade ourselves inside of the house. And so for the next 30 minutes, they put heavy furniture in front of all the doors and the windows. They blocked everything as best as they could. They got kitchen knives and they got an axe that they had inside to chop some wood. And so they go upstairs, they lock themselves in the master bedroom with their weapons and their dogs. And they get on the bed and they just decide all we can do is wait until the sun comes up. During the time they were barricading their house, they would look out from time to time and they would see the 5 creatures just sitting on that gravel area right in front of their house, just waiting for them. When they finally went upstairs and barricaded themselves in that room, they immediately heard the creatures move off of the gravel. And they heard a couple of them at least walk onto the porch and start pacing around the porch. And it's totally silent besides the sounds of these creatures. And they were clearly communicating with each other. They were bumping into walls and then they were howling at each other. There was clear communication happening where they were trying to coordinate some sort of attack on the family. Now, the way the house was set up is there was a 2nd floor roof, and then the 1st floor was a little bit wider than the 2nd floor and had its own kind of separate roof. And after a while, the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They left the porch and it's just silence. And then they would hear them jump onto that 1st roof. The scary thing about this is that if you walked around the roof, you could actually look into the second floor windows. And so they're laying there, and periodically they'd be looking out their window. There was windows on either side of the room they were in, but there was a thin curtain between them and the window. And so from time to time, these creatures would walk past their windows, and they would stop, they'd put their paws up onto the window, and they would look inside. But there was a very thin sheet between them and the glass, so they couldn't see the creature, and the creature couldn't see them. All night they're listening to these creatures running around, and sometimes they'd hear really loud scratching, like they had figured something out and they were trying to burrow their way into the house. But after a whole night of this, they never actually broke the glass. They never got inside the house. As the sun started to come up in the morning, the creatures jumped off the roof and they could hear them running away. And for about an hour they didn't hear anything outside. The sun's come up and they felt safe again. And so they left their room, they go downstairs, and they finally open it up, and all over their property are signs of huge creatures that had been on their property. Massive footprints with huge claws at the end. They found tufts of hair that had gotten caught on fence posts. And even scarier is they found all these points on the house, in particular on the second floor when they were walking on that roof, where there was clear markings that they had tried to burrow into the house. There were these deep-seated scratch marks into the side of the house. The front door had been scratched apart. I mean, it was very clear that whatever these creatures were, they were trying to get into the house, but they had just been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the family that they sold the house and they moved very quickly after that, and they have not experienced anything like that since they left.